No one was asking for this character, but here she is anyway. We have Halloween Mami, a dark type debuffer focused on single target damage amplification and damage over time effects. And if you want the takeaway right away, if you have a high Ascension Ren, there's not really any reason to pull for her unless of course you are a Mami fan. But let's talk about why that is the case and what other sort of things you might want to consider when it comes to Halloween Mami, because there's a bit more to the story than what I just said. So, talking about Halloween Mami, we have to start with her battle skill, which is a single target instance of damage, and everything she does is single target, by the way, and it decreases enemy defense, and then it also applies a new debuff called Candyholic to the target. Now, what does Candyholic do? It says the following: when cursed, decreases defense and increases damage taken. So it makes the enemy take more damage if they have curse on them. Now, how do you get curse? And also, Candyholic by itself doesn't seem to actually do anything, because you need to also have curse on it. Well, basically the rest of her kit all is part of her ability. The ability says the following: on own attack to Candyholic enemy has a chance to curse, which of course might be lowered if the enemy has resistance to curse, but let's say the enemy is weak to dark and has very low or maybe no resistance to curse, it will then curse the enemy. So that's how you get curse. And also keep in mind, this is something that I tested, the skill that applies Candyholic will then also immediately apply the curse. So you don't need to use skill and then do another attack afterwards to actually get the curse on. The attack that applies Candyholic also will apply the curse, so this will be immediately active. Then it says the following: when a Candyholic enemy is present, increases all enemies' ongoing damage. Now, ongoing damage just means damage over time effects. Damage over time effects are ailments that, as the name implies, deal damage over time. And keep in mind that Vortex from Swimsuit Sayaka is also a damage over time effect. What else does it say? Well, on own special attack decreases all enemy speed by 3%, which lasts for 2 turns and a maximum of 3 stacks, which doesn't really do that much. It's a very small debuff, but it's another part of a kit that you can make use of. But to be fair, I didn't really see much use in this one, but better than not having it, I guess. So the idea, as you can already tell, is you apply this to a single enemy, this Candyholic debuff with a skill, and then you do a lot more damage towards that enemy, so it opens this enemy up for taking a lot more increased damage. And then also you will have a curse on the enemy, and you will also buff everyone's damage over time effect. Awesome, sounds pretty nice so far. And then to round the entire kit out, we have the special attack, which once again is a single target hit that also applies a curse to the target and then increases the target's damage taken. So one thing to note about this curse and the curse from her passive. The curse from her passive does count as a passive effect. And what have we learned about passive effects? Passive effects cannot be cleansed. So, for example, the boss in the current score attack can remove its own ailments. But passive effects can't be cleansed, therefore the curse from her passive stays on, because even ailment removal doesn't get rid of it. But on top of that, also because, I guess the way they coded it, or because this might also be another side effect of it being a passive, the curse from her special attack actually stacks with the curse from her passive. So if you use a special attack and the enemy already has Candyholic, you will actually have 2 curses on the enemy. So yes, that means you have 2 curses, double the damage, which means that both of those curses can get popped by dot explosion. Nice, fun fact about that. So yeah, even though the curse from the passive can't be removed, it still gets exploded by dot explosion. So that's a thing to remember, which of course makes the dot explosion even more powerful. So yeah, we can see you basically pick one enemy, usually the boss, and then you give that boss damage increase, you give that boss a curse, and then you use your special to get even more damage increase, even more curse, and really lay into that one enemy. Awesome. Now I'm going to quickly mention the other parts of her kit as well before we continue on, which is the support ability, which if you equip it to a debuffer, increases ongoing damage dealt and increases speed, which does seem to be a really good effect to put on your Swimsuit Sayaka, because Swimsuit Sayaka also does a decent amount of damage with her ongoing damage. And also keep in mind that Halloween Mami's base attack is really high, like as high as Swimsuit Sayaka's. That means that of course her support Kyoku is going to give a lot more base attack to whoever you equip it to. So other characters that like to deal damage like for example a Ren or a Swimsuit Sayaka, they like supports that also increase their base attack by a lot. So Mami is also good at being a just good base attack stat stick for supporters, while also increasing ongoing damage and a bit of speed. And it also says on basic attack runs 2 MP, which is basically nothing. But yeah, really nice support ability, at least to use. So at least in that regard, she can be kind of helpful. Even if you're not specifically putting her on your team, she can at least help out another buffer that wants to deal some damage. And then her EX Crystallis, which is good enough that you're always going to use it, says increases ongoing damage up by 40%. Now this means own ongoing damage. This comes up a lot when people ask things like, oh, does this effect apply to others as well or only to you? It only applies to other characters if it specifically mentions this. This is not just part of EX Crystallis, but just any passive ability, any debuff, any buff, anything that just says does this thing. If you're asking, does it also do that for other characters? Only if it specifically mentions that. Only if it says something like on own or allies attacks, for example, or increases own or allies damage dealt, right? But if it doesn't say that, if it just says increases damage dealt, then it only applies to this character, okay? So yes, increases ongoing damage dealt by 40% for this character, which means for Halloween Mami. And also on attack to Candyholic enemy, increases on attack by 2% for 2 turns, maximum 10 stacks. The weird part is it's only for 2 turns, which means it can technically fall off. I think Ren has a very similar effect on her EX Crystallis, but that one doesn't fall off. That one is just permanent. I don't know why they didn't just make it permanent. It's kind of weird. That said, if you're taking a turn with Halloween Mami, you're probably going to attack an enemy that has Candyholic on it anyway. Because if you're targeting an enemy that doesn't have it, you're going to use your skill and apply Candyholic to that target anyway, and then you get the buff. So I don't know. And once again, because it's a passive effect in this case, it cannot be cleansed by enemies. Awesome. So that's it for Crystallis. Now I can already tell you the other Crystallis you're probably gonna use. So the thing is, you might want to use her special multiple times if there's multiple enemies, or if the curse from her special gets exploded, you need to get the curse from her special back onto the target. And both for multi-target scenarios and for scenarios where the dot gets exploded by someone else, you probably want to get back to special pretty quickly, which means that MP % sounds pretty nice for her. At the same time, theoretically, you could also use more speed if you want to, because more speed also means more specials in the same amount of time. But on top of that, what you could also use for your other Crystallis besides your EX is, for example, increased damage to elemental weakness, or theoretically the increased damage over time effects. However, keep in mind that one's not actually that important because it's only like 20%. Like the Crystallis that increases damage over time effect only gives like 20%, which is like nothing. It's like actually nothing. I don't know why they made it such a low number, because the weakness increase effect, for example, is like 24%. It's like way more. Like, why would you use that one? The attack % increase is 25%. That is like way better. What? That just sounds better. I don't know. So the actual damage over time Crystallis is not actually that good, sadly. And you can just use other ones instead as well, if you wanted to use that. But if you wanted to go full support and don't care about her damage, you would probably just go MP and speed as usual. Now I'm also going to quickly mention her Ascension 2, which is actually kind of bad. When a Candyholic enemy is present, increases speed by 10%, which isn't a whole lot, and on special attack advantage action all by 10%. So both of these effects are just to make sure, like I said, if, for example, there are multiple enemies you want to use her special on, or if you want her special to trigger multiple times because the dot from it gets exploded multiple times, then this Ascension 2 helps you get more specials out in the same amount of time by having more speed and by getting more turns at the same time. So very helpful. But if you don't care for those scenarios because you're only using her to increase like the damage against a singular target, speed and action advantage does basically nothing for you, like absolutely nothing. So it's kind of a useless A2 if you're not specifically playing a damage over time team, and even on a damage over time team it's only okay-ish, right? Okay, so that's it for the general kit that you use her for her general playstyle and how you would expect to use her. Now let's actually talk about how she compares to some other characters. Now the main character that you would of course compare her to is Ren. Why? Because the main core thing that this Halloween Mami does for you is damage amplification, right? That's the thing that she does. You have other debuffers, for example, let's say Tsukasa. Tsukasa also has damage amplification, but Tsukasa also has buff removal, and that is actually really powerful. Like, there's a lot of bosses in the game that have really powerful buffs, and Tsukasa can take away those buffs, and that makes Tsukasa really powerful. So that's a way that you can use Tsukasa, for example. You have Nemu, who specifically increases forest damage, and right now there's not really any good forest damage dealer outside of a limited character, so she's kind of bad at that. But theoretically, if there was a good forest type damage dealer, Nemu's niche would be specifically increasing forest damage, right? So that's a different niche that is on there. Felicia has the niche to be able to stun characters, right? They all have their own different niches that they can use. And for Halloween Mami, her niche is kind of damage over time, right? But if you don't play her in a damage over time team, and we're going to talk about damage over time teams in a little bit, right? But if we're not specifically playing her in a damage over time team, or we're thinking about what else does she do outside of damage over time effects, what she does really well is damage amplification. She does that much better than almost every other debuffer in the game, right? But let's put some numbers on that, on how good that damage amplification actually is. And I'm going to compare her to Ren, because Ren is the other debuffer that does really high damage amplification. So if you were to rank every single debuffer by the damage amplification, at the very top you would have Ren and now Halloween Mami, and then basically every single other debuffer comes after that, right? But like I said, let's put some numbers on that. So at Ascension 0, a Ren at Ascension 0 gives your team about a total of 75% damage increase against the target. If you take the defense reduction and the damage taken increase into account, and the fact that Ascension 0 you only have special level 4, etc., it's about 75% damage increase you get against the target with a Ren at Ascension 0 against 3 targets. At Ascension 5, because Ascension 4 for a debuffer increases the strength of their debuffs and also raises their special cap, which of course means that they can, if their special scales with the damage increase that they apply, then of course higher Ascension means, in this case higher special means higher damage taken increase. So at Ascension 5, Eren does about 116% damage taken increase against 3 targets. I need to keep mentioning this because it's about to come up. Because Halloween Mami at Ascension 0 does 110% damage taken increase against a single target. So you see, Ascension 5 Ren, 116% against 3 targets, and Halloween Mami does 110% against a single target. But that's only at Ascension 0. What if we go up to Ascension 5, right? At Ascension 5, Halloween Mami does a whopping 173% damage taken increase against a single target. Which sounds kind of insane, and it kind of is, but at the same time there is something I need to mention. Because she has a lot of defense reduction, even more so than Ren. And the thing about defense reduction is that there is theoretically a cap that you can hit with defense reduction, at which point lowering defense doesn't give you more damage, right? And that cap is kind of hard to grasp, because the cap is reached when a character attacks an enemy and that character's attack is 16 times higher than the enemy's defense, which of course means that it depends on the character that's attacking, and it depends on the enemy, because every enemy might have a different defense value, right? So you can't really tell for which attacker or which general character the defense reduction breakpoint is going to be hit, like when the actual cap is going to be hit. Like, so you can't really tell that. You don't know if I were to apply more defense reduction to the enemy now, am I already at the cap? Or am I really far away from the cap? You just don't really know that, right? So the entire 173% number that I just mentioned might be lower, depending on the enemy, right? We don't really know. So keep that in mind. But that's a really high amount of defense reduction, a damage taken increase. But it's only against a single character. And keep in mind that this is also dependent on the enemy being cursed. Because keep in mind, the passive of Candyholic is when cursed, decreases enemy defense and increases damage taken. If you take that passive away, she does about as much damage taken increase as Ren. At which point, she's just a single target Ren at that point, if the enemy cannot be cursed. Okay, of course you can go the other direction and say, well, Ren can't get most of her kit off when the enemy is immune to wound. And it's partially true that she can't really stack her defense reduction as quickly, but the thing is, she can still technically apply all of her debuffs even if the enemy is immune to wound. Theoretically, she can still do it, right? It's just much slower and much harder, but theoretically she can actually still get there, okay? Keep that in mind. But yes, wound immunity screws over Ren, and curse immunity screws over Halloween Mami as far as their actual damage amplification goes and most of their kit goes, so keep all of that in mind. So yes, now that we know that as Ascension 5, she actually does much more damage taken increase against a single target, does that mean you should roll for Halloween Mami? I mean, Ascension 5 on a limited character, when a current standard character that is extremely powerful against most bosses in the game does a similar amount, and even more so when this limited character is only at Ascension 0 or Ascension 1. Oof, that's a big oof. That's maybe not a great value proposition for most people out there. Okay, so as far as the damage reduction goes, or rather the damage taken increase goes for your team, if you're not a whale, like if you're not a whale who can actually get to Ascension 3, Ascension 4, Ascension 5 or whatsoever on this character, you probably are not gonna be picking Halloween Mami over Ren when it comes to just damage taken increase. Okay, keep that in mind. But what about the other part of her kit? What about her buffs and her buffs to like ongoing damage dealt, and her curse that also deals ongoing damage, and her EX that gives her even more ongoing damage, and she has a high base attack, and she can give herself with her EX crystals even more attack, right? So it seems like she can actually do a lot of damage over time damage with her curses. Yes, 2 curses, right? So does she actually do high amounts of damage over time damage? The answer is kind of yes. So she actually does do a sizable chunk of damage over time damage. So can you play her as a sub DPS? Because Ren also is played as a sub DPS, and so is Swimsuit Sayaka, by the way. So Swimsuit Sayaka and Ren are also sub DPS. But I've looked at the numbers, and I've of course used all of these characters quite a lot now. And I can tell you that Swimsuit Sayaka and Ren, they still do way more damage than Halloween Mami, and that basically comes down to the innate drawbacks that damage over time has. And I want to mention those drawbacks right now, because the drawbacks I'm about to mention, they still apply, even if they introduce more damage over time focused characters in the future, unless those characters have like specific parts of their kit that say specifically does this and this and that to remedy some of the drawbacks that dots have. You'll see what I mean in a second. So the first drawback that damage over time teams have is dots have to be exploded. When I say exploded, I've said it a bunch of times now. I mean, for example, in effect like Nemu's special, which says consumes all remaining turns of ongoing damage effects on targets and immediately deals their total damage. This is what I mean with dot explosion. You take all of the dots you have on the enemy, and then you immediately take all of the damage that they would have dealt over their entire lifetime and immediately deal it in one single instance of damage. Now, the reason why this is so important is not just because, oh yeah, some enemies are really slow and you don't deal any damage outside of their turn, so you have to wait for them to take their turn. And if your team is much faster than the enemy takes a lot less turns, meaning they take a lot less damage over time. That part is not even that important. The more important part is the fact that in Exedra, unlike similar games like Star Rail, the enemy is going to be broken at some point, and the whole idea is when the enemy is broken, they take a lot more damage, so you want to have all your damage come in when the enemy is broken. Damage over time doesn't deal any damage when the enemy is broken, because the enemy doesn't take any turns when it's broken. So in order for the enemy to actually take damage when it's broken, you have to explode your damage over time effects, meaning you are required to have someone or maybe multiple people on your team that can explode your damage over time effects. Otherwise, they deal no damage, like nothing, okay? Right now, how many characters can even do it? We have Hana, who can explode dots, but Hana's a 4-star character that outside of exploding dots does nothing, so And secondly, you have Nemu, who is specifically for buffing forest damage, but she does have some damage over time increases in her kit, so she's alright, I guess, but she might not be the greatest choice for specifically a damage over time team, because she also has low base attack and her own poison does very little damage, right? So we would really like to have another character that is maybe as focused on damage over time as something like a Halloween Mami that can also explode your damage over time effects. But right now, such a character doesn't exist. And Nemu, if you use Nemu for that, like I said, she has low base attack, her own poison doesn't do that much. She's more so focused on trying to increase forest damage, which you're playing Halloween Mami for her curse. Curse isn't forest damage. But also the fact that Nemu only explodes dots on special, which isn't very often, right? So if an enemy is broken, how many specials with Nemu are you going to be able to get out before the enemy comes out of break? Maybe 1? Maybe at most 2. That's not a lot, right? Only 2 explosions at most. Do you know how many turns attackers get in that same amount of time? And every single one of those attacker hits really fucking hard. So right now, as far as dot explosions is concerned, we are lacking in good options for that. But even if they actually introduce more characters that can explode dots more often, then of course you have the downside that you actually need your characters to be able to apply their dots in between dot explosions again, which might lead to some really awkward turn combinations where the right characters are not able to get their turns out at the right moment to reapply their dots before it gets exploded. So that's kind of sad, and at the same time it can go the other way, where if a character whose dot is already on the enemy takes another turn, that turn is useless. Like if you already have all your damage over time effects on the enemy, for example on a Nemu, or actually on a Halloween Mami for example, what do? You just use your normal attack and that's it. You've done nothing. Your turn is useless as far as damage over time teams is concerned if the dot is already on the enemy. So it can go both ways. On either your turn not arriving when it needs to, or your turn arriving when it doesn't need to. So that's one of the drawbacks of dot. Another drawback. A lot of characters get bonus effects when their ailments are on the enemy. For example, with Halloween Mami, we know that when her curse is on the enemy, and Kenny Holic as well, it makes the enemy take more damage. That effect temporarily goes away if your curse is exploded. Nemu, with her Ascension 2, increases all damage dealt to poison targets by 30%. That's a strong Ascension. Goes away when you explode the dot. That said, at least with Nemu, if she's the one exploding the dot, she applies it back. But let's say you have another character on the team that explodes dot, and someone else explodes her poison, and then suddenly her special effect is gone. Like, what? Mifuyu gains increased crit damage against cursed targets. Yeah, that effect goes away if you explode the curse, right? And there might be more characters in the future. The next Alina that gets removed, that gets added to the game, I assume also is going to deal bonus damage to damage of time targets, is my guess at least, because she did that in Manga Record, right? And it makes sense releasing her next to Halloween Mami. Whatever her effect might be to increase damage against ailment targets or whatever, might also go away when you explode dots. So there are always characters that have these special effects that temporarily go away when you then explode those dots. And that's kind of sad. You can kind of play around that, but that's one more thing you need to play around. What else do we have? Well, this next part is something that, like I said earlier, might be remedied by a character's kit, which is that damage over time effects cannot crit. When you explode a damage over time effect, it doesn't crit, at least as far as I know. It cannot crit. But that then means that you would need to have a character that says, like, as part of their passives, damage over time effects can now crit, right? That would solve that. But without that, attackers can crit, which means that attackers can stack their damage really, really high, much higher than damage over time effects, which is sort of capped. They're capped at how much damage they can do because they cannot crit. That's kind of sad. And then you have another drawback, which is that enemies, of course, can have resistances to ailments even outside of their element weaknesses. Let's say, for example, an enemy is weak to dark. You can now bring a dark type attacker. But let's say that enemy that is weak to dark is immune to curse or has really high resistance to curse, because that's possible. Usually it doesn't happen, but it's possible. Yeah, now that suddenly you can't play a damage over time character of dark type against that enemy, even though they are dark weak. That's kind of sad. If you're saying that shouldn't happen, the newest Chaos boss, or at least one of the newest Chaos bosses, is weak to Void, but has 100% wound resistance. Why? Because Ren is overpowered, and Ren would have trivialized that boss fight, and the developers know that. The developers know in making that boss, they want that boss to be Void weak, but they also know that Ren would hard counter that boss, so they gave that boss 100% wound resistance. Stuff like that might happen in the future as well, that they might just give bosses really high resistances to some ailments, even though they're weak to that element, and then suddenly you can't play damage over time effect. Not to mention that it sort of shoehorns you into playing specific elements, because let's say, for example, your best damage over time effect is dark type, and the enemy just isn't weak to dark. Well, now all of these other damage over time characters you might have, like your Nemu, for example, let's say Nemu is part of your damage over time effect team as well. Now that Nemu can't play, because Nemu would require your Halloween Mami to function, which now she can't. So that's also something to keep in mind, that you're gonna have ailments of different elements usually coming together. Like you might have curse and poison and burn, and they're all coming together. But if the enemy is immune to one of those, suddenly it doesn't work. Sorry. So there's a lot of drawbacks the damage over time teams face, that even in the future, when more characters for damage over time teams get added, they might still have to worry about these problems. This is something that I wanted to mention. So, if we bring it back now to talk about Halloween Mami as a whole, you have really high damage amplification, but in order to reach that high damage amplification and surpass Ren, She needs Ascensions, and Ascensions on a limited character for specifically free-to-play is always a really tough value proposition. At the same time, she does it only against a single target anyway. And at the same time, if you look at the other thing that she does, which is focus on damage over time effects, damage over time playstyles in general right now don't work. And even in the future, when more characters get released that might play into that playstyle, might still have unique drawbacks that make it worse than, for example, playing attackers instead, right? So you have really strong strengths for Halloween Mami on both fronts, right? You have the damage application, you have the damage over time stuff, but both of these have their unique drawbacks, and both of these might not be the best value proposition for your roles right now. Now keep in mind that, like I said, Halloween Alina that gets introduced in next week is probably also going to play alongside with damage over time effects, with ailments, is my guess at least, which, like I said, she did that also in Mega Record. But she's Flame, and you probably already have either a High Ascension Momoko or a High Ascension Kyoko, and they don't have to rely on other characters to be able to do their damage, which might already mean that Halloween Alina might already be a bad value proposition. So yeah, it's not really looking that great. But to be fair, let's not beat around the bush when it comes to the actual strength. These characters are strong. Like this Halloween Mami, I mean, is strong, right? It's just that because you would have to require both other characters or high ascensions, the actual value proposition might not be the best. And that's everything I wanted to say. Took a long time, but I got it out there. Thank you all for watching this. Hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, become a member today, and I'll see you guys next time. Also, shout out to my members, Chaibean, Lipflaminkel, and Simple Troll. Thank you very much.